Alrighty. Hi, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to What's Going On. This is the very first episode that we're doing today. And so my name is Sydney. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the Diversity Peer Education Scholar with Suffolk University's Student Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion. So right here, right now, we have today, the first episode. We'll be talking about Indigenous Peoples Day, which happened yesterday. So I have this guest with us today. Corey, would you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hi. Thank you so much for having us here. I'm just one individual person representing our small group called Italian Americans for Indigenous Peoples Day. And I'm just here to give a little bit about our perspective and the more progressive Italian movement and that is supporting not only Indigenous Peoples Day, but also the removal of Columbus Day. And so because it's often considered an Italian American holiday and an Italian American issue, it's a really complicated thing. So I'd love to have that discussion. We love having that discussion with everyone, and I look forward to talking with you today. So thanks for doing this.
Thank you. And before we proceed, would you also share with us your pronouns?
Oh, yes. And they should be on my photo, but my pronouns are she and her.
Thank you. So you mentioned about Indigenous Peoples Day and also removal of Columbus Day. So for the audience who are not aware of the origins of Columbus Day, can you actually share with us what you know and how they come about?
Absolutely. So I actually had a great conversation about this with my dad's cousin who lives in London, and was like, "What's the controversy?" He's not on the Italian side of the family, and I explained to him a little bit about what happened and why it's such a personal thing for the Italian Americans to sort of accept this removal of Columbus. So Christopher Columbus, as we all know now, was not a good guy. He was an explorer, but he was also responsible for a great deal of atrocities and caused a lot of pain to indigenous people, primarily in Central and South America. So, he isn't someone that really we should be honoring. But at the time in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Italian Americans were not considered to be essentially white. We were at the bottom of the social pile, as were the Irish. I mean, Italians don't have the only immigrant sob story, but that's a whole nother issue. So there were a lot of incidents involving Italian Americans. There was an infamous lynching in the early 1900s in which 11 Italian Americans were brutally murdered for a crime they didn't commit. And so Columbus Day was seen when it was founded by, I mean, it was starting to be celebrated in the late 1800s, but I think it was I wrote it down somewhere, 1937 is when President Harrison officially made it a holiday. And that's because for the last like 40 or 50 years, Columbus was the only symbol of sort of Catholic excellence that the Catholic groups could hold on to. So, like the Knights of Columbus, which was founded and named themselves after Columbus, did so because, and the Knights of Columbus was a cool group. When they were founded, they were anti KKK. Eventually that became they were founded as a Catholic anti-defamation society. So it's sort of to push back against some of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant white supremacy, and they became really fierce social advocates for racial equality and justice. And the reason they chose Columbus is because the white Anglo-Saxon dominant group respected that man for what he had done and for his exploration. And so they linked themselves to that name because it was something that could get them a little bit of credence with the prevailing and dominant group. And so now that we know, almost 100 years after the presidential proclamation of the holiday, now that we know, Columbus maybe isn't the best guy. Why don't we like revert to St. Francis Day and go feed some birds in the yard or something? Um, there are so many progressive Italian groups, not just here in Boston, but all over the country, who are advocating, not in our name, that we understand that Columbus was really, really important for a really long time to us having equal status in American society, but we have it now. So can we please rethink this? And there are so many other Italian groups who are having a hard time accepting that. So that's sort of the history of why Columbus Day started. It was definitely something that was meant to make Italians fit in a little bit more and deal with some of the discrimination. But, I think as time has passed, it's come time to rethink that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting when you talk about how people hold on, right, to the idea of Columbus Day and the pride that comes from it. So, would you want to talk a little bit about following what the history that you covered? Why would people, instead of removing the day entirely, why would we want to replace it with Indigenous Peoples Day?
Yeah, so that's, the town that I work in, the town that I live in, and a bunch of other surrounding towns are starting to have these conversations at the town level. There is actually a state uh, Indigenous Peoples Day mass.org has been a statewide um, attempt at getting the day recognized at the state level. But for now, it's town by town. And every town is going through the same exact process where the Italian Americans don't want to give up Columbus Day. The Indigenous people rightfully feel the day is harmful. And then there's a bunch of sort of middle of the road, some Italian, some not folks who are trying to bridge the gap and say, let's do both. We'll have Italian Heritage Day and Indigenous Peoples Day. But I think the fact remains that because we had this holiday that was named after this man who single-handedly destroyed the lives of millions of the Taino people, let's give them the day. That it's sharing it isn't the way forward,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to
Mm-hmm.
do it that way, I think dishonors what the Indigenous people still have been going through for, Italian Americans have been discriminated against for, we were discriminated against for a couple of 100 years. I mean, for the Indigenous people, it's been thousands of years, and they're still essentially invisible in our society. And so to give them that day, because, do we even need a day? And that's the harder discussion. I think also in the intervening decades since 1937, different towns and different states have had different celebrations of Columbus Day. And so, I know some residents of Massachusetts grew up having Columbus Day parades where you'd wave your Italian flags. And so for them, it really is synonymous with Italian pride. And I understand, we try and use a lot of empathy in our work with our Italian communities that we're kind of called on to talk to. And of course, they don't want to really talk, but we try to really explain to them, we get it. Like, we know it's hard to give up just this awesome sense of pride that you have in being Italian, because, who doesn't love being Italian? But that our pride doesn't get to take precedence over other people's pain. And that these statues really represent something hurtful to so many people. And this day is a day that celebrates the torture and extermination of thousands and millions of people. So why should we keep it? We really shouldn't. And I think, the tide is turning. I think at this point, it's just a matter of time. I mean, this weekend was so encouraging, not just in Boston, but around the country. I think so many progressive Italians are starting to speak up. And it's interesting, I'm sure other cultures feel the same way, but I know, like, my mom's all Italian, my dad isn't. And I grew up in my mom's, small Italian American town. And I think there's this real sense of like brotherhood, and like, you don't turn your back on the community. And Italians are, our family, my family are all like, civil servants, we're all police officers and firefighters and, nurses and teachers. Like, that's just what we do. And it's a very community oriented, very gregarious, social kind of people, which I'm sure you could say about other groups as well. But I think that sense of going against the group is really hard and really painful, especially for Italian American men. And so finding over the past few days so much social media about progressive Italian Americans, including men, and not just young people anymore, who are saying, you know what, maybe Columbus Day really is bad. Maybe we don't need it. Maybe we can find something else. So it's definitely a process, but it's an important one.
So when you talk about, let's talk more about the disparity, right, in terms of opinions within the Italian American community. So you mentioned about how Italian Americans historically had faced discrimination, right? And that's a tougher discussion to talk about. But other than that, what would you say is the other issues that's facing? Basically, why are not most Italian Americans on board? Like, what do you think caused that rift?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I don't think if there was a good answer to it, we wouldn't have the problems we have in our country today. What does cause this rift in belief? That people matter, that people's feelings matter. Somehow feelings got co-opted as being something that only progressive people care about. That we don't want people to be healthy or have health care or be happy. So I think it's a bigger question, and certainly not one that I, as a high school English teacher, am qualified to answer. But I will say the one thing I've learned from really trying to listen to some of the Italian American people, especially even like my own mom, who I managed to sort of twist her around to my way of thinking over the years, but she still, pushes back every once in a while, like, I miss Columbus Day. I'm like, Mom, you never did anything on Columbus Day. Well, I might have. So, I think for a lot of people, there's that, again, that sense of pride, that sense of tradition. I think it's really just that fear of change, and that, things, this has been a holiday since 1937. So the majority of people alive today have been born since then, right? I mean, there are obviously a few people born before that, but, I think most people who are at least active in all of our forums. And I think, so since they were born or before they were born, it's been a holiday. And so it sometimes, I think, feels, especially to some older generations, and even to people my own age, born in the 70s, that everything is changing. They're trying to take everything away. They're knocking down all the statues. And it's like, well, yes, maybe, but only the things that are hurtful, only the things that are harmful, because we're really lucky to be in this position in time where we are reassessing what it means to be American, what it means to be a democracy, what it means um, to really try to work together. And also, who is visible in our society, who has a say, who has a seat at the table, who has a voice. And so I think the trying to elevate other voices is the most important part. We didn't come into being on our own. We actually started to support the Indigenous Peoples Day Massachusetts supporters who have been fighting this fight for decades. So Matoi Monroe is our advisor. She is an Indigenous person. She does a lot of work for the United American Indians of New England. And, she gets really attacked by the Italian American community on anytime she speaks on this topic. And so, a bunch of us just happened to notice in a local way what was going on. And so we just sort of stepped up to try and deflect some of that aggression. Like, you know what? Don't be mad at that lady. Be mad at us, because we're Italian American and we're telling you it's wrong. And so they don't like us very much. But, I think trying again to do it with empathy, but it's definitely hard. And I think fear and change, and the fact that our country is in such turmoil right now, just makes this one more thing that people have to entertain being different. And when everything changes, it's terrifying, especially I'm guessing as you get older and you see more and more change. So I think it's a little bit of that all.
Yeah, and I have to agree in that way that I hope that the viewers and audience and listeners tuning into this podcast understand that this is not just about Italian Americans pushing for change in Indigenous peoples, that, diversity, equity, and inclusion is something that we all have to do in some shape or form, right? And so this topic happens to be about a community, but anyone can take part. Anyone who's not Italian American can take part in pushing for change of replacing Columbus Day. And let's talk about when you mentioned statues.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a difficult topic, right? Some people who are for the cause have been saying that, well, I agree with the sentiment of taking down statues and replacing them, not just like Columbus, but any colonizer or basically the people who have um, bought slaves, you know. So, and some of the people within communities, regardless of identities, they're talking about how they're supportive of the sentiment behind why we should remove certain statues. At the same time, they are part of history. So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I'm certainly not the first person to say this, but there's a difference between historical acknowledgement and commemoration. And I think, a statue says, whoa, look at this guy. And it's usually a guy, and he's often on a horse. But a statue is something that says this is a person to be looked up to, often because the statue is actually on a pedestal, right? It's something that's elevated. And I think that's honoring, that's commemoration. And that's not how we learn history. If we learned history from statues, we would be a pretty ignorant group of people. So, absolutely, the Knights of Columbus can take that statue from Boston and put it in their private collection. Absolutely, they can go into museums where everyone can see them. I don't think, I think a lot of the accusations about removing the statues and removing some of the iconography of white supremacy is that we're trying to erase history. And I think, obviously we're just trying to erase the adulation of the wrong people in history as being something we're going to continue doing now. So yes, that was important. Yes, people revered this person. Yes, it's yes, it's something that was important, but those people don't need to be honored anymore. They don't need to be commemorated. And so, the statues are just one piece of the story.
That's a great answer. I might even actually co-opt that for my own use. I mean,
I took it from someone else too, I'm sure.
And we just kind of evolve it and like take it. Yeah, I think that's what matters, right? Like kind of pushing the message out. And so you are a teacher, right?
Yes, I teach high school English.
So as far as you know, even though you don't teach history, what do you think about American education, especially in high school, middle school, elementary school level? Like, what do you think is basically, I guess, two questions. Is the education system doing enough? Are they teaching history holistically? And if not, what can they do better? And if yes, what are the examples?
Okay, yeah. I mean, I don't have a wide range of experience in this. I can certainly answer as a parent. My son's in high school also. I can answer a little bit as a teacher working with some colleagues. I think American education is interesting. We don't have a national curriculum of any kind, so you'll see it widely varies from state to state. And we all know about the great funding and racial discrepancies in education across the country, especially in urban areas, especially in rural areas and other areas that are plagued with poverty. That students don't always have access to new textbooks or new sources or even the internet in ways that other communities do. So, for example, I was in last week a city council meeting in Newton where they were trying to establish Indigenous Peoples Day, and it did pass through the council, but they have to have that, like it passed to a vote. They haven't voted on it yet. But it was the public comment, and there were, I think, 5 or 6 young people who spoke at this meeting, as young as a 3rd grader and as old as a high school senior, in addition to adults. And all of the children were very pro-Indigenous Peoples Day. They were incredibly articulate. They were amazing. There was this one 7th grader who was so like sort of expressive and understanding of the Italian American side, but just not having it. Like, no, you guys, you can't do this anymore. You can't have Columbus Day. And I was just amazed that these kids knew from such a young age that that Columbus isn't a great guy to look up to anymore. And we know that now. And one of the kids quoted Maya Angelou and said, now that we know better, we can do better. And I thought, kids know that. maybe the adults need to work on that a little bit too. So, I think a lot of it's education at the school level. I think a lot of it is education at home. And we do have Indigenous people and Newton has a very small Indigenous population in the community. So these are people in your town. The Indigenous population in Massachusetts is very small, and even nationwide, I think it's 5 million approximately Indigenous people to over 15 million or 16 million Italian Americans. So definitely nowhere near as large a population. But I think it probably varies nationally. I think we always say we're so lucky to live in Massachusetts, and we do have a great statewide educational system. But again, it varies from place to place. So to answer your first question, is it enough? I say it depends where you live, and what kind of education you get, and how realistic it is. But I would say for the most part, almost every story I've heard from any school, I think kids are being taught today that, like, yes, Columbus did this and that, but he wasn't a good guy. And I think that general acknowledgement is out there. And then what can they do better? Obviously just, letting people know the truth. And that's the one thing, when you get to the concept of truth, that's where we butt our heads against the most, because we live in an era of what's called alternative facts or alternative truth. And that's muddied the waters a little bit. We will, for every historian who says Columbus wrote in his journal about the rape of young girls, there's someone else who finds some PhD somewhere who says Columbus's journal was exaggerated because he was fighting with De las Casas or something like that. So when you get down to the facts level, it gets a lot more complicated. But I think the educational system and what it could do better probably depends on where you live and what your resources are.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting points about the Indigenous people, like population within not just Massachusetts, but across the states, there are people who are like, oh, they are just a small group, they're the minority. But we also got to think about the context, right, and how history brought us to this point, right, which is how they were massacred, how Columbus and the other people came in and brought diseases to the people here and killed many of them, and hence they are like not there are not many of them basically around, and so it's all the more important for us to not speak for them, but to uplift their voices, when they have a concern and things like that, using our privilege to uplift their voice.
Exactly. Amplification of voices, for sure.
Precisely. Yeah, definitely agree. So going back to your movement, Italian Americans for Indigenous Peoples Day, would you, because we during our phone call before this, you actually share about how it came about, and I find that it's really interesting. So would you want to share with the audience how this movement was actually founded? And also, I'll leave the question for after you answer.
Okay, so one question. Sounds good. So so we were all so there's 5 of us who founded the Boston version of our group, and we have since discovered there are so many more groups just like us all over the country, and so we're all Facebook group friends with one another. There's one, my favorite one is name-wise is called Bella Ciao. It's anti-racist paisans out of Buffalo, I think, Buffalo, New York. So, they all have different names, but the idea is that, that it's something inherent in Italian Americans. I mean, yeah, we had Mussolini and fascism, but we also had some of the first anti-fascist movements. And, I try not to use anti-fascism too often because apparently people who watch Fox News have issues with that phrase, but and I think it's important to try not to use some catchphrases and be authentic with people and talking about them. But I think there's a really strong progressive sense that Italian people have about looking out for our community and correcting injustice. That's just something that, we're so driven to do on like even a personal level. Like, if I see, like I was the mom who at the park, if I saw a little kid getting picked on by another little kid and I don't know the kid, I go right up to the other kid, it's sort of that, I don't know if it's Italian or just me, but So, but so basically the five of us, we're all women. We are all, interestingly enough, either all Italian or half Italian, but our Italian is from our mothers. So we all have non-Italian last names for the most part. I think one of us has an Italian last name. So we sound like a group of Irish Italians for the most part. But we all got sort of involved working with Matoi Monroe on an individual level and supporting the movement, only to find out that, oh, you're Italian, so am I, bumping into each other at the State House on Bill Day for the Indigenous. This is my plug for the MAindigenousagenda.org, the Indigenous Legislative Agenda that the Native people have been advocating for. And that's the anti-racist mascots and the change the state flag and seal bill, among some others. So we all sort of were working individually on this, and then decided to support Matoi by being a little bit more organized and working together. And so, so she just sort of, she's our advisor, and we don't do anything without checking with her first. The most important thing we try to do is say, stop talking to us. We're Italian American, but this is not about us. And yet the demand for people to acknowledge Italian Americans in their town is so great, because Italian American people are really involved in their towns. And so, so we just sort of try to redirect the conversation to the Indigenous people and say, hey, please go talk to them. This is about them, what they need, what they've asked for, what they've been working toward. What they've been demanding in terms of just basic recognition and sort of human dignity, but also please make this less about us and more about them. And so I think we're all looking forward to when we don't have to exist anymore. So.
Yeah, I think sometimes I have this like reflection moment where excuse me, we think about how our activism, actually the goal is to not have to do that anymore, right? The goal is for everyone to kind of become inclusive and become like progressive. I feel is not even the word for it. It's just to be inclusive and be nice to people regardless of their identities. Like you can have all your beliefs while still respecting somebody else. And so you mentioned about having support from the Indigenous community. Am I correct? So what's your movement's interaction with the Indigenous community?
So that's a great question. So so we're advised by them. We try not to do anything. This isn't our movement. We did not start this. We are not players in this. We are not stakeholders. We are just allies and supporters. And again, trying to reframe the conversation away from us as much as possible. So anytime we get a request for, from a journalist or for a news article, we make sure like, well, have you spoken to the actual stakeholders of this bill or this, movement first? And then, if you want the Italian American perspective, then we're happy to do it. I think the majority of what we really want to do is reach out to other Italian Americans and just say, hey, if you actually believe in this too, will you join us? And that's why this weekend in Boston on Saturday, during the peaceful protest and the march, it was so uplifting. There were so many Italian Americans there who didn't know we were organized, and like, oh my gosh, there's a group, like we can join it, because they were there. And it makes you feel, a little bit less alone, especially if your nanny doesn't like you doing this, it feels really good to see other Italian kids there whose nannies also don't like them fighting against Columbus. So I'm afraid to get off your question a little bit, but we support primarily the United American Indians of New England. As I mentioned, one of their principal leaders is Matoi Monroe, who's been advocating for her people for absolutely decades, probably since before I was born, although I feel like she's not older than me. And she's just amazing. She's a powerhouse and a voice for so many people who don't have voices. And so we really just are trying to be supportive and not make the conversation about us.
That's good advice. That's really good advice. Going along with what we talked about, uplifting communities, and how do we do that? and the advice that you gave just now, the suggestions that you gave just now was really great. So let's continue on with that conversation about how earlier you mentioned and throughout the conversation that your goal or the movement's goal is to reach out to more Italian Americans and also to help in that sense bridge the gap. Would you talk about some struggles that the movement has and how do you overcome that? And also, by the way, for everyone watching and also listening, there will be actually a question and answer session couple minutes before 1 o'clock. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask then. But yeah, for Corinne.
Yeah. Again, being just sort of we're not, not our own movement primarily. So, but I think the biggest struggle we have is finding supporters. And actually, I would say that was our biggest struggle. I almost feel like we've had so many people join. So we have a website. And I can share that with everybody in the chat or at the end or however you want to do it. But we just have our statement there saying, Columbus does not represent us. And we understand that there was a time when it was important, but that time is not now. And so we need to dismantle him as a status of white supremacy. And so trying to get people to sign our statement has been our biggest struggle, but we've had absolutely hundreds of signers now. We have lots of state legislators. There have been different mayors of different towns who have supported this. And these are all people who identify as Italian American. And so, and I think I mentioned too, the gender divide, right? That sort of patriarchal, historical Italian society divide, getting men to join also had been quite difficult. But again, in the last couple weeks and even months, that's been changing. And even just this weekend, I mean, we talked to so many men at the protest on Saturday, and so many men have joined our group since then, that I feel that, if that's our struggle, then it's getting better. And we're joining with other groups around the country. And there are more groups around the country as well, who are progressive Italian groups trying to advocate for racial justice, social change, and equality. So yeah, so that's really our biggest struggle, I would say. And we're all in that struggle. It doesn't matter who you are. I think that's the ultimate struggle our country's going through right now, is like, just advocating for people to be cared for and heard.
That's great. So when you mentioned racial justice, right? So I'm gonna throw you a really difficult question here.
I don't know if this one was on that list.
Well, it's a conversation, so we're just gonna go with it.
Okay, cool.
So I mean, so far you've been dealing with the questions really great. So I thought I'll ask you in that sense more of your opinion question. I mean, after all, this is a conversation about your experience, right, and your opinions, and also your work. So when you mention racial justice, do you think that people who support what Italian Americans for Indigenous peoples they are doing, do you think the supporters of this movement also have to be cognizant of systemic racism?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, and again, speaking as a white person and a white woman who has had every possible privilege and zero barriers thrown at me my entire life, my entire education, I'm coming from that perspective. But I think that, stopping because it's uncomfortable, like I usually come to the point, and I'm speaking now also just as myself, this is just my own opinion, so I don't want everyone to be like, I don't know that this is what all of my friends and co-founders think, although I feel like we're all personally on the same page with this stuff, is that you can't, oh shoot, I had a really good thing I was gonna say. Give me 1 second. I'm having a middle-aged lady brain fart.
Take your time. It's okay.
No, this idea, oh, I remember what it was. Thank you. Discomfort, right? Like you have to sit, if, this idea of being a white person, if you want to do the work, if you want to support people who do not have voices and who are advocating for them now, you have to be comfortable with discomfort, and you have to sit in that and be okay with it. You can't cry. You can't be like, but what about me? But what about my holiday? This isn't about me. This isn't about my holiday. There's the land back movement for the Native American people. I mean, they deserve their land back. Does that mean I should give up my house? Probably, honestly. People don't want to have these uncomfortable conversations because it involves giving up stuff that we didn't rightfully earn. And so I think sitting in that discomfort, accepting the fact that you have, and this is where I find most of my, and I'll speak very personally about just my family members coming from a very Republican white family, and growing up in rural New York State. I feel that they feel we worked really hard, we were very poor, we struggled, why can't everyone else? Not seeing that privilege and not willing to feel the discomfort that comes with acknowledging privilege that you don't think you had. And so I think that acceptance of it, that willingness to be uncomfortable, the willingness to have someone ask you to stop talking because you're taking up too much airspace, and the discomfort of maybe saying the wrong phrase or the wrong word, because sometimes it's going to happen. And when I first started, if I said the wrong term for something, or or said something the wrong way, and someone corrected me, I would start to warble like I was going to cry. And then I was like, oh my gosh, white lady tears, no. So, you have to, it's not toughening up so much. It's just saying, you know what, it's okay to feel really uncomfortable about this, because it sucks that white people have been really sucky and that I have to deal with the legacy of that suckiness. So sorry, that was a very elementary school way of explaining it, but with my vocabulary, you think I'd have a more sophisticated English teacher vocabulary. But yeah, I think the discomfort piece is the most important, and the commitment to racial justice has to be, the intersectional commitment to everyone across the board. So this is just one group. If you think about Indigenous people nationally, how invisible they have been. And again, because there are so few, because so many of them were killed by white settlers, the missing and murdered Indigenous women who just disappear in Canada and the United States with, very little investigation or follow through. The lack of awareness about how the COVID-19 epidemic is affecting the Native American community. I learned on Saturday that Massachusetts isn't even counting them as a demographic for COVID-19. So our state doesn't actually know how many Indigenous people have died or been sickened by COVID, because they don't count as a demographic. And so that invisibility of Indigenous groups, I think, is something that is pretty appalling and that we should all be appalled by. But again, that's just one group. And there was a nice intersectional moment on Saturday when we got to Faneuil Hall, and there was a group there. I think it was, I'll think of the name of the group. I don't want to misrepresent the speaker or the group, but it's also in a bunch of the articles about the day. And it was, Nathaniel, I think Faneuil was his name, at Faneuil Hall, was a slave trader. And so they want to change the name. And of course, who wouldn't support that? But the groups came together and we all chanted together. And then all the Faneuil Hall supporters marched to the waterfront with the Indigenous people after. So it was this nice moment of sort of cross colliding where, groups support one another in their quest for racial justice. So yeah, I don't think you can separate any one group from the other, but yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I thank you for bringing up the term intersectionality, right? When we talk about how oppression can look different and have different experiences, but oppression of one is oppression of everyone else, or no liberation if a certain community is oppressed, right? So, so before we end, does the audience have any questions? You can just unmute yourself. You can ask Corey a question. You can ask me a question. Just gonna give you a few seconds for that.
Wow, we explained everything so well. It's so nice of
It's a
everyone to be
teacher,
here today. Thank you guys. This is great.
and it's a teacher's like coming up, be like, no questions. Seems like
I know.
everyone understands.
Like, yeah, if you know, what is that we learn in teacher school? You don't ask if anyone has a question. You say, now what questions do you all have, right? We assume you have a question, you just don't want to ask it. So,
That's
or
a great
comment,
phrasing.
right? Like if you don't have a question, but some sort of a comment.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. And one of the things you made me think about, which I think is so important, is the role of allies when it comes to supporting any people who've been historically or presently oppressed, and what a tricky role that can be to navigate, and how important it is that we all think about that.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, thank you so much. I mean, there's no good way to be an ally, right? You just again have to be okay with being uncomfortable and just listen and let other people take the lead. Those are the only two things I've learned so far. And I'd love to hear more about what other people have figured out doing that work too. So thank you.
You mentioned before there was a famous court trial from Italian group in Boston. It was a Sacco Vanzetti trial,
Mm-hmm.
and they were leftists. They claimed they were anarchists. They were not. They were leftists, and they were involved with unions and the Italian community.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was the first time in the United States where there was a great deal of support besides Italians. There's a broad support. And that, I think, kind of opened up, if not at that point, but it did make a lot of room for Italians in politics, particularly up there. And if I was going to build a statue to anybody, it'd be to those two men.
That's definitely been suggested as a replacement for the waterfront park statue. So yeah, thank you for adding them to the conversation, because I did not mention Sacco and Vanzetti, and they are, very iconic to those of us living in Massachusetts, right? But really, right, I didn't even think of it that way, but the predominance we have now of Italian Americans in politics absolutely came after that. So yeah, thank you. That's great.
Yeah, I think that really, that was the entry point for Italians in politics, because it also blended in with the labor movement. I mean, there was a lot of things involved with that trial.
Yes, right. The union. You're right. The unions and the labor movement were huge also then too. So yeah. Definitely that as well. So that's interesting. I'm actually gonna to research that a little bit more, because I don't know much about like what happened after that. So I love that connection. Thank you.
Well, the establishment had to pay a price in a way, because it had engendered so much interest, and they just couldn't put the interest aside, because it wasn't just those Italians. It was everybody else, a lot of other nationalities involved. So, there was a price they paid, the establishment, if you will, paid.
And again, what you just said there too, right? That the Italian experience is not unique, right? That every immigrant group has had, but we're lucky that we've had a few, these sort of high profile cases that have made us sort of predominant. I mean, I don't know. I always think when I think of Italian Americans in American society, I think of, obviously politics, but also Hollywood and like movies, and especially like gangster movies, right? Oh, and the mafia in general, but also the movies about it, right? That's kind of what we're known for. And so, where do we appear, and what do we have that makes us feel that we're different from other immigrant groups who've also been discriminated against, who've also not been welcomed, who also had to work menial labor jobs, even though they were more skilled than that or not, arriving here, who also had to fight all these horrible things. Yeah, but we've been, lucky in the sense that we have had these hallmark cases and these things to make our community stand out a little bit. So now the idea is that we have to use that privilege, and we have to use that visibility that we do have in society as Italian Americans to amplify for the others. So cool. Thank you so much for that. I'm gonna do a little more research on the long-term effects of Sacco and Vanzetti in American civic life.
The Irish immigration into the United States, like during the Civil War, a lot of the Irish left Ireland to come to the United States so they could learn how to fight the English and go back to
And then go
Ireland
back and fight the
and
English. So yeah, we are not the only sob story, right? There are a lot of people fighting a lot of other people all over the world.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Well, I enjoy this wholesome moment. That's the whole point of the podcast, and like learning from one another and like new cases.
Yeah.
And now I guess it's been reviewed, like the possible person who's gonna take over in that way, or not take over, but replace the statues and names at the waterfront. I also want to give this chance for anybody else who has any questions, or if you want to share anything that you didn't know about and you learned today, feel free before we wrap up the session. Going once, going twice. Alrighty. I always do that so that people know, instead of like I just closing it off.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. So, Corey, would you let the audience know where can they find you, and also how can they get involved?
Yes, so we do have a website, Italians, actually, let me double check and see. I think it's Italians for IPD.org, but I think I know my own website. I'm gonna double check. Yep, Italians for IPD.org. Okay, I'm just checking. So that's our official website. We also have a Facebook group, Italian Americans for Indigenous Peoples Day. And as I mentioned, there are tons of national and also regional similar groups you can find for any for any affiliation that you might want to have, or that you feel you have a chance to be a voice in. I think the idea is that it's great to not have to affiliate yourself with any particular group or affinity group of any kind. It'd be really nice to be able to say, well, we're just all people, but we're not. So we have to sort of work in this. But yeah, so Italians for IPD.org, and also on Facebook. Yeah, and we'd love to have, we have a lot of non-Italian people sign as well, that they just support our statement and be like, hey, look, Italians don't all love Columbus. Cool. So feel free to come along and sign the statement, just as this. I think there's a little button at the end that says, I identify as Italian, or I don't, but I support it. And it's super, super easy. So we'd love to have you join us or follow us on Facebook. And also, of course, my big pitch, though, is not for us, but for the Indigenous people who have been doing this work for decades. So you can go to maindigenousagenda.org, and that's where you'll find the current Massachusetts state legislature bills, the flag and seal bill, the anti-racist mascots bill, and the Indigenous Peoples Day bill. And then you can also go to indigenouspeoplesdayma.org, where they are also advocating for the statewide Indigenous Peoples Day. And I would argue that those two groups are much more important than our group. So please check them out.
Thank you, Corey. So check them out. And also just a reminder that Indigenous people's rights in there, and fighting for them does not only happen in September, start of October. It's a year-long thing. It's going on every single time. And Corey and her group goes on to town halls around the state to kind of help pass legislation, or kind of like fight for the replacement of Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. So please connect with them, and also connect with us. Once again, What's Going On is supported by Suffolk University Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion. You can find us at SU Diversity on all the social media sites, including Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And it's been great. It's been a great informative session. Thank you, Corey, and thank you for everyone for coming.
Thank you, Cindy, for all the work that you're doing for this, and for all of the things that you do. It's super awesome. And thank you guys for giving up an hour of your day to be with us. This is super great. And I loved my sheet of notes that I learned from you guys. And thank you so much for doing this. So thanks. It's been great to be here.
Thank you. And Good. Yeah, and I look forward to everyone in the next episode of What's Going On. So take care, everyone. Stay safe. Wash your hands and take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.